Um, Thank you. Okay, so good morning, everyone. It's a beautiful, cloudy, coolish day in Cape Town. For those of you who are also in Cape Town, for others, I think I've heard some people were flying in the early hours of the morning, and others have been up since very, very early, I guess, to prepare for this morning. So today we are going to talk, we're going to have a critical discussion. I think as the NPO working group, when we convene like this, we always regard it as a discussion towards an outcome, right? So today this critical discussion will be on the future of NPO regulation in South Africa. You will, for those of you who were part of the launch towards the end of January, it was on the 28th of January, you will know something about that report that's on the screen there, mitigating the unintended consequences of FATF recommendations, the nonprofit sector in South Africa. And today we want to focus about regulatory frameworks and self-regulation, as the slide there says. We are really meeting today at the turning point for our sector. The rules of the game are currently, it's rapidly changing, and it makes some of us very nervous. Some of us, haven't slept since the last, not slept much rather, since we heard of the amendment that came through. And some of us are working hard on that. But for today, our goal is very specific. We are also, through the discussions, gathering some evidence, and there's obviously expertise needed to develop a formal policy brief on self-regulation. And so much of the discussion today will go towards gathering information towards that too, right? As I said, we face a major challenge from the draft General Laws Amendment Bill of 2025, which was published just last month. So we kind of, it was very late notice, and I don't think enough people are even aware of it. This bill proposes changing the NPO director from a helpful facilitator into a powerful enforcer that can issue fines of up to $1 million and even prison terms. So I don't want to alert or alarm us too early in the day, but I think we must say it the way we've read and understood this bill to be about at the moment. So we do feel this one-size-fits-all approach, it really risks stifling the crucial work, and it's low risk work that most of you do every day, right? Most of us do. As we don't want this to impact that negatively on this important work that all of us do. So we believe that there is a better way. And as I said, I mentioned earlier on the report that's on the screen there. And that report, actually, this research report does recommend self-regulation as the key to protecting our sector. And so without further ado, I'm going to introduce you to the presenters. As on the next slide, we will see the program for the day, for the 2 hours rather, and so that I always make this mistake of not introducing myself. So let me do this 5 minutes after I started to talk. I'm Ferial Domingo. I'm the Acting Executive Director of Ignatello. I'm also the chairperson of the NPO Working Group. And I'm very, very happy to be here with you. But as I said, already pointed out, what is the purpose of this webinar, what we will be talking to today. And on the screen there, you'll see we're going to have 3 speakers. One will be Glenn Farrett, and I'll introduce him in a minute. But then just to say, Ricardo Weinhardt will be doing another session there on self-regulation. And Sangeeta Goswami, who I'm pretty sure have already arrived to join us. She's out in the Netherlands, and she'll bring the global trends and perspectives to the discussion today. And Bound will then talk to us about the way forward, and then we'll go promptly at around 10 to 12, maybe quarter to 12, on closing remarks. Okay, so let's move to the first presenter. On the next slide, I think I've spoken to the objectives already. So here are the speakers, which I have mentioned already. On the next slide, then we will commence with Glenn Farrett. And just a very short introduction. I'm pretty sure many of you know Glenn. So Glenn, he's been very active in analyzing and addressing the impact of Financial Action Task Force regulations on the South African NPO landscape, particularly concerning grey listing and the risks of overregulation under the guise of countering terrorist financing. He is, of course, his work primarily has focused on land rights, regulatory frameworks, and the protection of civil society spaces. So he's really been a strong, and as we know him, social justice and development activist for many, many years. So I'd like to ask Glenn then to proceed. He will be sharing some insights and findings from the LIA, Legislative Impact Assessment, to show exactly where the current system is failing NPOs and where the burdens are heaviest. Glenn, can I hand over to you? Thank you.
Thanks, Ferial, and thanks for that warm introduction. Good morning, colleagues. Good afternoon or evening, wherever you are. I am standing in for Advocate Pina, who was the lead researcher on this project. I'm obviously not Advocate Pina, so I do hope that I can do him justice in what he has prepared. If we could move to the first slide. Please. Colleagues, so I think that one of the key outcomes of the Inyatelo study on unintended consequences, which I hope all of you will take the time and trouble to familiarize yourself with, was that South Africa needs to consider the self-regulatory environment for the NPO sector. I think we've got to recognize, as is often said by our colleagues in government and the regulatory part of our ecosystem, that one of the unintended consequences, which we mustn't overlook from the FATF and then the grey listing and the GLAA process, has been that it has assisted us to grapple with a range of complex questions relating to the NPO sector in South Africa. And one of those key outstanding questions, which have been quite thorny for us over many, many years since our transition from apartheid to democracy, has in fact been the question of self-regulation. So one of the main findings from the study, which was undertaken by the team, was that government and the NPO sector should promote and incentivize self-regulation for the sector. And a key part of this is an independent statutory body which will be credible and should be able to accredit, should be through accreditation for NPOs, meet through the accreditation of NPOs, meet good governance standards. But I think we've got to sort of differentiate the conversation here, and in much of this presentation, we will have to unpack some of these, the dimensions of this question. So promoting and incentivizing self-regulation begins at the level of the NPO as the first sort of unit of measurement, if we could put it like that. So how do we make sure that nonprofits themselves are incentivized to regulate themselves? So self-regulation begins with the individual NPO. That is necessary. But then broadly, when we step out of the individual NPO and the incentives and the support for good governance within the organization, is the broader sector. Now, we know that the sector is complex and diverse. So one size fits all approach can't happen. And that is where we come to, where we need to come to, and we need to arrive at. What does that type of self-regulation framework look like? And I think we also need to consider what potential drawbacks might be associated with it and how those should be mitigated. If we could move to the next slide. So as you know, and I think this is important to bear in mind, that FATF recommends NPO self-regulation as part of a risk-based approach to anti-money laundering and countering terror financing. Now, that means the universe of what we are attempting to regulate in this risk-based approach are at-risk nonprofits or nonprofits whose activities, their operations and their work may place them at risk. So first and foremost, I think drawing from the fact of recommendations and frameworks, we are saying that a risk-based approach must therefore be differentiated. It must deal with at-risk activities, operations, and so on, and cannot be a one-size-fits-all that the entirety of the universe of nonprofits are placed under this burdensome and restrictive regulatory framework. So as we all know, FATF's stance is to encourage best practice. So that is acknowledging that many NPOs have or can develop their own standards to mitigate risk. That's an important thing. We have in South Africa a history of codes of good practice, which we have developed. Can we evolve those standards? How do we strengthen them, right? So that's the first level. The next one is that in the application of rules, FATF requires a targeted approach. So self-regulation can be a critical part of this, particularly in addressing risks within the segment of NPOs that are actually vulnerable to abuse. Then I think South Africans are familiar with this way of doing things, is that we must engage with each other, right? And that means that as per the revised FATF recommendation 8, there's an emphasis on governments. And I think by government here, we understand the wider universe of regulatory bodies and state departments engaging with nonprofits and their self-regulatory initiatives. So in other words, in the past, the nonprofit sector has developed codes of ethics, codes of various kinds for themselves. That has not always been mutually reinforced with state institutions and regulatory bodies. And I think we need to, in our evolution of self-regulatory thinking, frameworks and approaches, try to find alignment and mutual reinforcement. And then I think lastly, we have to prevent self-regulation from stifling legitimate and in many cases, low-risk charitable activities. So this is what we've drawn from within the research, and these are what the findings support. If we could go to the next slide. Okay, so colleagues here, we want to just focus on recommendation 8. It says that in terms of internal self-regulation, recommendation 8 does not require NPOs to proactively undertake measures to understand and mitigate risk. The FATF draft paper provides guidance for NPOs that would like to take proactive steps to protect themselves against money laundering and terror finance abuse. There are 3 pillars which are proposed, which is to understand and mitigate the risks at an individual level. I think if you recall in our opening remarks, we were saying, how does the essential nonprofit, the standalone organization, improve and enhance its response to the potential threat of money laundering and terror financing? And you will all be familiar with anti-corruption policies that have been widely promoted within the sector, both in conjunction with donors, but as well, I think, with government broadly speaking. So we have some yardstick of saying the individual NPO, how does it generate for itself an anti-corruption policy, a whistleblowing policy, what other policy interventions can strengthen at that level? The next bit of the next pillar is to involve ourselves in a collective or collaborative self-regulatory initiative. So are there various ways of us thinking beyond the rhetoric towards practical measures that frame the sector, right? And the last is, of course, to put in place risk-based internal controls and good governance. If we could go to the next slide, colleagues. Okay, so the internal self-regulation requires that the country risk assessment that needs to be implemented should be targeted, proportionate, risk-based internal mitigating measures for efficiently dealing with abuse risks. So we have an opportunity here just to highlight, I think, for the way forward, colleagues, the mutual evaluation process that is underway and will continue for the next year or so, that we can begin to get to grips with what the actual risk is and where it is. I know that many people in the nonprofit sector believe that we are being unduly targeted, both by FATF and in the GLAA, particularly these amendments to say that the NPO sector is high risk. And many of us don't think that there's sufficient evidence to say, in fact, the sector as a whole is high risk. So this is the evidence that we need to engage with. Now, from the basis of the evidence, we need to develop and apply adequate levels and types of preventative and detective tools and controls. Yeah, the remaining risks after this process is designed as designated as the residual risk, right? There will always be, in other words, no matter how much evidence we gather, no matter how best we try and be targeted in our controls and preventative, there will always be risk. But the extent to which that risk actually exists is something that the interventions will help us respond to. So when we're deciding on the specific scope and types of activities that is a terror finance abuse risk, the mitigating measures should be meeting that need, right? Should be responding to the actual level of abuse risk that we are attempting to deal with. Sorry, Phil. Okay. So, and the ways we do this is the country risk assessment. That's the mutual evaluation process, part of the mutual evaluation process. And I know some of you have been involved in that in some detail previously. And perhaps for the NPO sector to conduct its own terror finance abuse risk assessment. And then lastly, I suppose that the domestic legislative and regulatory framework should be assessed to ensure that it's in line with the identified risks, but also with international guidance and good practice. Could we go to the next slide? Okay. Colleagues, so I'm just going to try and sort of focus some of these things, right, for us, because the report is comprehensive and has many different levels of finding and evidence that needs to be unpacked. We just want to limit ourselves to the conversation about the question of self-regulation. Now, as we've found, in line with the risk-based approach, the measures necessary for an NPO operating in a high-risk context to reduce its terror financing risk, money laundering risk, would have to be more stringent. And I think we all understand that. So that's what the risk-based approach requires. But there has to be a very clear defining of what that high-risk context may be. Many of you may know that there is a contention between historically, but also currently, between what type of activities may be deemed in another jurisdiction or by another country, for instance, to say, well, that cause is a terrorist cause. And in the South African context, we would say, no, that's not a terrorist cause. That's a solidarity action. So we need to have a context-specific definition of what high risk means. And then obviously, we have to differentiate between low and high risk activities and organizations operating in those different contexts. Furthermore, depending on the risk, NPOs could take a range of practical steps to be confident that they know the donors and partners they work with and are able to identify and manage the associated risk. Furthermore, that for high-risk NPOs, and I think this is the key thing that Gary has highlighted here, in other words, not the totality of the universe of nonprofits, but for high risk only, we need to implement a know your donor partner set of procedures. So what has been found is that both with terror financing, potentially with money laundering, or probably more likely associated with money laundering, is that there is scope for abuse of NPOs by individuals and organizations that give them money. So how do we begin to reinforce a know your donor partner procedure? This, I think, is a live conversation because the NPO Act as it stands, so leave aside all the very pernicious and potentially punitive things that have been proposed in the current round of amendments. In the Act as it was originally drafted, there was supposed to be a code of good practice for the governance of NPOs, which was developed. But furthermore, there was also a part that said, hey, can we have a code of practice for donors and philanthropies and funders of NPOs? How do we use that opportunity to evolve a framework for donor transparency so that it does not fall to the individual NPO to confront a donor, but we generalize and socialize a framework that says donors need to be transparent, with who they are giving money for, where they are getting their money from, and in that way, could that strengthen us in this sort of procedure? So obviously, for NPOs, we would all like to be able to screen our partners. The law requires that the beneficial ownership of partners should be declared, as well as the question of staff, right? So what are the procedures that we could do to prevent money laundering and terror financing through those interventions or procedures or frameworks that might help us? We should apply financial control measures, keeping detailed records, monitoring, and so on. So this college is kind of already there. The question of how can it be strengthened? And again, the emphasis here is not only, but particularly for high-risk NPOs. Are there different types of records that need to be kept more detailed? How do we monitor? How should NPOs individually monitor those things? And lastly, here it is the implementation of measures that respects our obligations, of course, under the UN Charter and international human rights law. Could we go to the next slide? Fidel, could you just keep a time check if we might be running behind? So colleagues, I think we've covered some of this. Our context, and our environment is increasingly, our context and the global environment is increasingly complex. And we have evolving, constantly emerging new demands at all levels, right? From legitimate international actors. And we are hoping with those partners, I think like Sangeeta and others, to safeguard the integrity and accountability of our operations. We have responded to these demands by developing, as I've said, standards and initiatives for individual organizational accountability and transparency. Recommendation 8 provides that countries should have in place measures focused on these NPOs. So these NPOs, again, in line with the risk-based approach, not the entirety of the sector, but which of these measures can be generalized to strengthen the sector. So remember that part of our finding here is there is an unintended consequence that we can improve governance, operation, impact, accountability of the sector as a whole beyond being punitive. But that has to be self-generated, mutually reinforcing with regulatory bodies, laws, and policies, and not simply to jump to the punitive approach, as I think we're seeing in some of these amendments. And jurisdictions or countries like ourselves should consider where they exist self-regulatory and relevant internal risk mitigation measures. Okay, Mandy, I note your question. I think that's a part of the discussion. If we could get to that. Could we move to the next slide, please? Okay, colleagues. So here's the thorny bit for us, right? We want to have representational and self-regulatory organizations, which are complex, right? So those of you who can recall, the South African NGO coalition, Sangoko, back in the day, was really a leading organization, sort of post-1994, in the representativity of, okay, Anne says she can't see the slides. I hope they're visible to you all, colleagues. So we don't have a easy path to representative self-regulatory organization. So in some, I think Ricardo will talk to this in his presentation as well, in some jurisdictions, in some countries like Mauritius, Seychelles, essentially you have one body that is recognized by government, partially funded by the state, that takes care of the NPO sector. Marcos in Mauritius, CEPS in Seychelles. In our context, we don't have that. And for many good reasons, we have said, hang on, if you're going to have a self-organized, representative, self-regulatory body, it needs to come from this diversity of the sector. Okay? Now, this is a question I think that needs interrogation. Is that possible for South Africa, for this sector at this time, to actually pursue a representational and self-regulatory organization? Because that's essentially what it is. We're saying there's going to be an umbrella organization which has unique resources that can play a role in protecting the sector against the abuses. Such an umbrella organization have a direct interest in preserving the legitimacy and reputation of NPOs, and in the development and promulgation of good practices for the organization in a wide variety of functions. The NPO sector and these umbrella organizations, so you can see what the research has suggested is maybe not a singularity of a body, not one body, but maybe a multiplicity of different types of umbrella organizations could be used to provide training and capacity building. Okay, so just think about that as from your own vantage point, your own experience, and say, is that something that can work in the South African context? If we could go, Philo, can I just have a time check, please?
Sorry, I think I was talking to you in a muted way. So Glenn,
Okay.
you've got 3 minutes.
Okay, thank you. I'm glad I checked in.
Thank you.
So could we jump to the slide without minimizing the value of these slides, which I know Inyatelo will share with you after, because Gary has put a lot of work into this, and I think I'm not probably doing it justice in this short space of time. But if we could jump to slide 14, is that okay? Are we there? So there are 4 key questions here that the research has sort of raised. why is self-regulation recommended? Essentially to simplify regulatory compliance, that is to mitigate in broad terms the compliance burden and to enhance the quality of internal NPO governance. Colleagues, so you follow that, right? It's a very simple thing. If you are self-regulated, the chances of helping to identify and mitigate terror financing, etc., works best. And the quality of those interventions, which are self-generated, right, will bolster the sector as a whole. The second question here that has been identified is how could self-regulation help address the unintended consequences? I think I'm kind of preaching to the choir probably for the people in this room, but it is identified here that we want to have a one-stop shop, right? That can actually address all our needs. That we have to choose or combine something between an independent regulator, which is a self-regulating body, or an evolution of the NPO directorate, right? So there might be a combination of these options, okay? You can have an interface between a self-regulatory body and then a DSD, a different kind of DSD that meets the requirements of FATF and our current challenges. That's a key idea that says we all recognize that the NPO directorate as it exists today must evolve into an independent regulator. Now, what does that look like? But alongside that, is there space for self-regulation? And I know that Ricardo will highlight some of the options, right? I think, are we on slide 15? So again, these are the continuations of these questions. A single statutory body for which NPOs? So our context retains unregistered voluntary associations, another complex question. There are NPCs, and what about those trusts that are regulated by the Master's Office? We have a complex conversation that needs to be held about our tax regime for nonprofits. And we need to, in doing all of that, ensure that we continue to effectively target and have proportionate measures on money laundering and terror financing. Self-regulation sets internal governance standards. It might provide governance and compliance guidelines, such as codes of conduct and templates. And the question of grant accreditation, registration, and the potential to monitor compliance at the pain of losing accreditation. And a self-regulatory mechanism could liaise with SARS, the FIC, DSD, and the banks. Okay, colleagues? So if we are on slide, I know that Gary was very keen on presenting these slides on the current GLAA amendments, but I would like us to just go, colleagues, to slides 18. Fido, I know I'm probably just running over time. My apologies. I just want to run through these, if you don't mind. From slide 18. So the first one here is that the database at the Department of Social Development, I don't need to tell you what the challenges are there, colleagues, but there are desperate and hard working attempts to resolve this, but the DSD needs to update the NPO database as a matter of urgency, and that it needs to be an interoperable network of regulatory databases. So you all know you've got a CIP registration. Some people are trust there that the Master's Office is its own problem. So can we urgently make sure that there is a database that is interoperable between the various bodies, but can firstly the NPO database at DSD be functional for purposes can be fit for purpose, right? The second recommendation is that regulatory dispensation for NPO needs to be reviewed and streamlined. So I know some of you here are much more familiar with this process, but there is an NPO policy task team. I think there's a recommendation 8 task team as well, which is attempting to get to grips with this reviewing and streamlining. I think that's a conversation that we need to have. How does that happen? Thirdly, the role of the NDA, please take this seriously, should be assessed to determine whether its mandate is appropriately aligned with the sector's needs and whether it is adequately structured and resourced. Fourthly, that government and the NPO sector should promote and incentivize self-regulation. And I have some thoughts on this, but they're not necessarily evidence from this particular piece of work that we've done. But certainly the incentive structure for an independent statutory body, is there, and there are ways in which we can explore the professionalization of the NPO sector. If it is built into a self-regulatory body, may extend to co-funding from things like the sectoral education and training authorities, right, to help the sector professionalize. If we can go to the next slide. Are we there? Okay, so recommendation 5 is that the sector must revise its own codes of ethics. Again, this is linked to what is our ability to speak to each other beyond our individual or sector-specific needs. And by sector, I mean like whether it's health and welfare or advocacy groups, etc., etc. Can we generate a revised NPO code of ethics that we all can sign on to? 6 is to complement self-regulation. As a complement to self-regulation, government and the NPO sector should foster enhanced collaborative engagement and communication through sustained and inclusive dialogues, continuously reviewing and adapting the regulatory requirements. And I think I want to say that there's a lot of progress has been made, but I think this needs consolidation. It needs formalization at some level between the sector. It's happening through these task teams. It's happening in the evolution of legislation and regulation much better than it has at any other time post the NPO Act itself in 1997. So this is an opportunity to consolidate that. And I think this extends beyond government. It must include other actors and stakeholders as well, notably the banking fraternity. The 7th recommendation is to meet the FATF guidelines of targeted, risk-based, and focused oversight. The funding regime and regulatory framework for NPOs needs to be considered in conjunction with each other. Many NPOs indicated that they are unable to afford the cost of formalizing and registering themselves and maintain a bank account, quite apart from raising funds to remain operational and compliant with regulatory requirements. So I think this is also for your consideration and for the research team and others. We need to really get to grips with the dynamics of the sector, both the registered, unregistered, and broadly speaking, what is the sector, right? What is it capable of doing? What is its basic operational sort of situation? And I know a lot of work has been done to try and get to grips with this. But if we're going to apply these targeted and focused oversight regimes, the sector needs generalized funding, and this reinforces a review of the role of institutions such as the NDA, and I may add from my own perspective, the CETAs, to ensure that there is an operable level of, there is a funding source that can ensure basic operations for NPOs. If we can go to the next to last slide, I'm hoping. Yeah. Recommendation 8 in this list is that the NPO sector, government, and other stakeholders should seek to facilitate the creation of partnerships for capacity building, for the core governance. And I think we're just amplifying the core, the key strategic point here, which includes NPO's core governance, financial tax and compliance, literacy and capabilities, the development of standardized templates with core content should be considered. So thankfully, in this moment, we're seeing the rollout of much more capacity building for NPOs. I think this question of standardizing that is something that we should usefully explore in conjunction with government and stakeholders. And I think one of the major findings of the survey in particular was the low level of financial literacy within the sector. So the response needs to be not only literacy, but core competencies and capabilities to assist nonprofits. 9 is that government and regulatory, should enhance the risk literacy. And that means an ongoing conversation about, and this is through both our detection of abuse, hopefully self-reported, where we can find a way to ensure that NPOs understand what the risks are. We know that this is a very English-heavy kind of world in which we live, particularly the FATF universe. How do we make sure that risk literacy is addressed through dedicated and appropriate forms of communication and training? 10, that NPOs should be encouraged to review their records regularly. 11, that NPOs need to be capacitated to have policies for various risks. And again, maybe we can all assist by developing standardized templates, working together to develop standardized templates. Fido, with your indulgence, I think we're almost done. So recommendations on the last page, recommendations 12 and 13. The banking status of NPOs needs to be investigated further in the context of the risk analysis management regimes, and that the NPO sector should seek closer collaboration. And I know that efforts are underway to ensure this with the banking sector, to assist us to have a mutual understanding of the needs and constraints, but also to promote financial inclusion. Lastly, colleagues, sorry for having gone over time, that government, whether through DSD or any other dedicated entity, needs to communicate more clearly, extensively, and timeously with the NPO sector regarding FATF recommendations and guidance, regulatory changes, and FATF or any other risk-based assessments concerning NPOs. Good news on that one, I think, is that a lot of the capacities exist now on the NPO side, particularly thanks to the NPO Working Group and other formations to meet government in these spaces. But secondly, I think there's a significant sea change on the part of regulators and government departments concerned with this area to reach out. So I think we're kind of finding ourselves in a space where this is entirely possible. So that's the good news. There are opportunities. Bad news is the complexity of self-regulation versus any other forms of regulation remain for us to solve. And the us is the who in the story is an open-ended question. But I think with all of you contributing, it is possible to take these recommendations into practical steps for change. Thank you, Firiel.
Thank you, Glenn. I know that one never allocates enough time. I mean, I think the presentation was great. I think there's a lot of thoughtful ideas and recommendations, especially that's come through for all of us to think about. But before we move on to the next presenter, can I ask if anyone has a question or clarity needed? We can open the floor for at least 1 or 2 at max questions. There will be another opportunity later on. I know the one question that came up about what is a high-risk NGO. Glenn said we'll just discuss that given if time allows us. If there's no questions, I don't see any hands up. Jocelyn, do you see any? No. Okay. So let's move on then to the next. I'm sure everybody's very keen to hear all the presentations. So we've got Ricardo Weinhardt. He is a specialist lawyer and governance expert. Ricardo has focused exclusively on nonprofit law since 1999, I think, if I'm not wrong, and operates his own legal practice. So he will discuss how we can build a credible, context-appropriate, self-regulatory framework that works for all of us. Ricardo will also just put on his own presentation now, and he will walk us through his presentation. So really appreciate Ricardo. I know he was traveling at the early hours of the morning, so very happy that he made it, he landed on time. Thanks.
Thank you, Farrell, and good day to everyone. I'm excited, but also nervous to be part of this discussion on self-regulation. I've got 10 slides, so if I stick to 1 minute a slide, I'll be done by 11 o'clock, so I will not keep you after that. First slide, we're going to just rewind the clock a bit. This is the report that came out in 1996, and it was a summit that was hosted during 1996. And reason why I'm referring to this is because the issue of self-regulation is not new. It's been there in 1996, before the NPO Act came out. There was this huge summit where they looked at issues of, within the non-profit sector. They discussed various issues. One of the issues that came up was the issue of self-regulation, and this is literally a picture that I've taken just to sort of highlight the conclusion that was reached at the time. And it was, after discussions, it was agreed that finally, and emanating more from a South African point of view, self-regulation could be seen as a bit of a luxury. In other words, they are empowered NGOs, what one could call progressive organizations, which have the ability, capacity, and willingness to regulate themselves. But one should consider whether, in terms of the history of South African civil society, this was not just a luxury for certain small grouping, and whether there should have been a supportive regulatory system for smaller emerging organizations. Now, that paragraph says a lot. Essentially, the intention was to create a system that is more supportive, especially for smaller organizations. Now, a lot has happened since 96, but there are some issues that are still the same. That is the reality. I think one of the issues that are still the same is the fact that we have a lot of smaller organizations. Now, it set the tone for the NPO bill and also the NPO Act. And this section 3, one of my favorite sections in the NPO Act, talks about the state's responsibility to non-profit organizations. And really that conclusion that we just looked at set the tone for this section, which, and I'll just read it for ease of reference. The state's responsibility to non-profit organizations within the limits prescribed by law. Every organ of state must determine and coordinate the implementation of its policies and measures in a manner designed to promote, support, and enhance the capacity of non-profits to perform their functions. Again, just in terms of the tone that was set at the conference and the tone that was set in the legislation, very important. Now, one thing I just want to mention also with the section 3 of the NPO Act is the fact that if you look at Kenya's PBO Act, which was on the table for quite a while, but it wasn't in operation. It came into operation a couple of months ago. This section has basically been repeated verbatim in the PBO Act of Kenya. So for me, it's an excellent example in terms of what we are doing. The question I've got is whether this section is still really fit for purpose in the existing context. To what extent has the context changed? Again, just a plug for Inatello. Inatello also raised this issue back in 2008. to regulate or to self-regulate. What is interesting, and I would encourage Inatelo perhaps to share this document, even though it's dated, you'll pick up from this document that the issues motivating the issue of self-regulation at that time did not include issues of anti-money laundering and terrorist financing. So that's an issue that clearly has evolved and is now quite important in the discussion about self-regulation. This was 2008. Fast forward 2009. NPO legal issues. If you haven't yet subscribed, please feel free to subscribe. But that's not the focus of what I want to talk about. This issue of compulsory registration came up when Pete visited South Africa. And this was in fact my first newsletter, July, August 2009. The issue of self-regulation came up after the Pete visited South Africa, and at that time it was quite contentious. This photo was taken 2011, NPO Directorate, and at that time I was given a tour, to the basement at the NPO Directorate, and I actually asked if I could take this picture. I took it. These were not letters of non-compliance that were sent out to organizations back in 2011. I tried to alert organizations to what was going to happen. And yeah, all of those, like the files, basically, especially the first one that you see there, it's all of those are letters. So there were quite a lot of letters that were sent out to organizations during that time. And that was shortly after the second summit that was hosted, or during the second summit, not after, but the second summit was hosted, I think in 2012. So around about that time, my time frame might be a bit incorrect. But the reason why I'm referring back to the history and also referring back to this is because we're still sitting with this. If you think this is just historic knowledge or historic references, the reality is that this has actually escalated. It's virtual now, electronic. You won't find this kind of a setup, but it's explained or translated in this notice on the South African government website, where 6,000 organizations were deregistered. So those organizations, some of them got deregistered, but they were reinstated, and there was a lapse of about 12 years where nothing really happened in terms of deregistration. And then FATF visited again and with their mutual evaluation report. And as we were about to be grey-listed, legislation got amended, and keeping the organizations that were non-compliant on the registration list was not an option anymore. But I'm pointing to that again because that's a lot of work. If we're talking about self-regulation, we're talking about assisting organizations that face issues of regulatory issues of compliance. That's a lot of work. So practically, you can escalate the number of, or the piles of documents, because now we're talking about more organizations that are in fact registered and that even may be compliant, and a lot that are non-compliant. So the workload has increased. And the reality is that the NPO Directorate, has capacity constraints. So this is essentially my second most important slide in this, where I'm effectively suggesting that, when we talk about issues of regulation and self-regulation, we need to define it. We don't have time to even try to define what we mean. The issue is that even if we focus on self-regulation, there will be regulation, so it won't be one or the other. I think it's quite important to take into account the broader context, and going back to that Section 3 of the NPO Act, the NPO Directorate was geared towards that, a more supportive, facilitatory role for the non-profit sector. In terms of recent developments, that role has drastically changed. My first question is whether or not the NPO Directorate is fit for that purpose. Now, I'm just asking the question. I've got my own conclusion, but I think it is important for us as we jump into this whole issue of the debate on regulation, and in the context of South Africa, the NPO Directorate has been to some extent a regulator, but not with enforcement powers. It is the DSD has been is a donor, and I think sometimes there's been a bit of confusion. If the NPO Directorate is given increased enforcement power, my question is whether the structure is suitable for that purpose. It is new, and I think what we've seen with some of the changes that have occurred in the last couple of years is that some of the institutions are really not up to speed, in terms of their mandate. And I'm not saying that to criticize, but that is the reality. Secondly, the scale of the non-profit sector is huge. So clearly, in terms of that mandate to assist, it's a noble section dealing with NPOs, but I'm not sure if why we're talking about self-regulation is it's not a reality anymore to expect the state to bear that burden in terms of assisting and equipping organizations. We now need to look at the non-profit sector to do that. And the question is, how do we do that? There are a lot of examples in South Africa itself. For time's sake, we can't really look at that. But as we are facing now increased regulation, potential for administrative fines, we are faced with a situation where board members are serving in a voluntary capacity, and they may very well be reluctant to do so if they're exposed to reputational risk of fines. So we need to look at solutions that are meaningful in the South African context, suitable for organizations. And when we adopt a risk-based approach, to make sure that risk is about suitability, a risk-based approach, that it's suitable within the South African context. The reality is, and this is what we've seen with the large-scale deregistration, is that organizations are suffering to comply with some of the most basic, arguably, some of the most basic reporting requirements. Now, the complexity has shifted in terms of anti-money laundering, anti-terrorist financing. I ask organizations, have you read this national risk assessment that came out in 2024? For the most part, they haven't done that. So complexity levels escalated, but we're still dealing with a sector that is largely community-based. There lots of capacity problems. And the question is, to what extent can we and should we combine efforts to ensure that we develop a system that is suitable in the South African context? There's a lot of information out there, but I think ultimately we need to consider what is suitable in the South African context. So instead of coming up with solutions, all I'm saying at this moment in time, firstly, it's a complex issue. For us to consider. All of us are faced with capacity constraints, and hence we need to take that into account. The legal landscape has shifted, and it's, in my view, irreversible. We're not going to go back. But we face inherent risks if we don't deal with this constructively. And unfortunately, there are some gaps, broadly within the non-profit sector. Prayer, I must apologize. I actually went over 2 minutes, so my apologies. But I would be remiss in not saying to Professor Edmore, thank you very much for the books. I'm still going to call you, but I feel so guilty that I haven't yet. But thank you so much.
Thank you, Ricardo. You've been very kind to us, but we actually had you up until 11:15. So if you want another few minutes, you're welcome. Otherwise, we'll open it up for any questions that individuals may have that I want to pose to you. Any questions? Let's see what's going on in the chat.
Farrell, there was a question about what is a high-risk NGO? How would we describe a high-risk NGO? Anyone can respond to that?
Hi, Cyril, if I can jump in. So From the sector review that we conducted now a few years back, I'm just going to read the text as it is. The inherent vulnerabilities that may potentially put an NPO at risk of terror financing is one. NPOs established or operated by individuals with known terrorist sympathies. Two, NPOs with activities in high-risk foreign jurisdictions. Three, NPOs with links to communities sympathetic to terrorist causes, including far-right causes. Four, NPOs receiving funds from and transferring funds to high-risk countries. So I'll just use an obvious example, Syria, Iran, the Democratic People's Republic of North Korea, for example, would be on that list, and NPOs using unverifiable methods for raising or transferring funds. So read together. I've also just dropped a bunch of stuff which gives some of the technical guidance here from the South African perspective. We've got the Tara Act and various other things. So for that, for the purposes of just a simplified thing is, those would be the sort of dimensions of a at-risk NPO, which does not mean that that NPO is doing anything wrong or unlawful. I just want to say these would be the characteristics for greater scrutiny. It does not translate into, in itself, some kind of finding of terror financing. It would just say, and I would say there's a reason why, colleagues, I'll draw attention to this thing about far-right causes. So in terms of what has been identified, surprisingly, actually, far-right organizations were found to be quite active in the terror financing space. Thanks.
Thanks, Glenn. And as Glenn noted, he's put quite a bit of information in the chat. So for those of you who would like to maybe just make note there or take the links, please so for further reading. Ricardo, I'm assuming then that you're good. You have no further comments. Is there anyone else who has a question for Ricardo or comment or any kind of concern on what he presented? I quite like that he took us down the history of, this not being the first rodeo. This is not being the first time that we hear about it. So many years passed, so many things that have happened in the past, research, papers were delivered, and right, it's only really in scope now. It's really, really in scope now. So I want to just, 1 more minute and allow anybody who has a question or comment on that subject. No. So then Soraya put a comment in the chat. I worry about the climbing costs in ensuring compliance. The taxation access profiles alone have added extra verifications required, which knock one off the system. This becomes very expensive in time and practitioner costs, which is becoming increasingly unsustainable. Again, these are the difficulties that we have to deal with as NPOs. Compliance is just becoming heavier and heavier and heavier. And for some of the smaller organizations, this is just unrealistic in cases, right? Anybody have a comment there?
Peril, perhaps I could just make a comment on that issue, just from the perspective of a legal practitioner. So in terms of the Financial Intelligence Center Act, there are accountable institutions like the banks would be, property practitioners, the estate agents, and also legal practitioners. So let's say if I had to onboard a client, an NPO client, and my practice is focusing on NPOs, I cannot just onboard, accept a mandate from a client and sign an agreement. I need to do the FICA verification, which is not only about getting IDs and proof of residence. I mean, we long past that. I need to do a risk-based assessment. If it's a legal entity, there's specific procedures that I need to do, which is it's risky to do it, and it's time, and it's the reality is that from the bank's perspective, the easier thing, sometimes is to do what they call de-risking, to close the bank account. Sometimes I'm not so excited about taking on certain work. And it's not like I'm in a position where I can pick and choose, but I'm now thinking, and this is unfortunately, there's a level of fear, in the atmosphere as well, because you get these site visits and inspections to check, have you done your due diligence in regard to your clients? Now, NPOs have been in the spotlight for the last couple of years. So as a practitioner focusing on NPOs, I need to make sure that I comply with those requirements. But, it can take you, let's say, an hour to do that if you do it properly, which increases the cost. And I'm just explaining that because, to add to what Soraya is saying, that's unfortunately escalating the whole issue of cost. And the reality is that for some, it's beneficial, they providing services. But for NPOs, it's not as easy. The costs are escalating. And it's not like donors are coming and say, but we'll pay for your additional compliance costs. That's a risk. And it's in the context that we talk about self-regulation. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So that risk, I mean, that cost is often seen as overheads, and we know how that is dealt with in the sector. Right? Thank you so much, Ricardo. So now what I'll do is we're going to now move on, Jocelyn, on the next slide. Yes, we're very, very excited that Sangeeta Goswami is able to join us all the way from the Netherlands. Sangeeta, who you have heard from on the NPO Working Group's platforms before. She is the Director of Policy and Advocacy at the Human Security Collective. They are a non-profit organization based in The Hague, Netherlands. Her work focuses on the intersection of national security and civil society, specifically addressing how counterterrorism and anti-money laundering regulations affect non-profit organizations. Today, she's coming to talk to us about how international trends and factor of compliance actually support the move towards sector-led oversight. Sangeeta, over to you. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, Ferial, and thank you for inviting me to this webinar. It's been interesting listening to the presentations this morning. Would I be able to share some slides? I've just asked. I have a few slides I wanted to show, but yeah, just while we sort that out. Thank you. Just while we sort that out, I think yeah, this question of, that Ricardo was posing, whether to regulate or to self-regulate, I think we really need both. I mean, I think we're past that stage, and, of course, we need regulation, but we also need self-regulation. The thing is that I think, as Ricardo again was saying, that there's been oversight and regulation of the NPO sector around for as long as NPOs, the professionalization of NPOs has happened, and is, from sort of the 19th century onwards in many parts of the world, and later in some other countries. But what has actually muddied the waters a little bit is this whole terrorism financing framework, the FATF framework, which requires sort of NPOs to be overseen and regulated for, so that they're not abused inadvertently for terrorism financing purposes. And that is sort of a legacy of the post 9/11 context, and the framework that was put in place then. And as a legal entity, nonprofit organizations were sort of singled out in that framework. And because that framework has so much power, countries are evaluated, and NPOs are a part of that evaluation process. They're named and shamed and put on blacklists and gray lists, and it impacts trade and aid. So kind of this terrorism financing oversight of the sector has sort of the conversation around it has overtaken the conversation around all other oversight of the sector, because clearly the sector, needs oversight of all kinds, whether that's on governance, on transparency, on accountability, needs self-regulation, all of that. But somehow this hard security, terrorism financing oversight has sort of taken over the conversation, much to the detriment of the sector in many parts of the world, and which is why we see these unintended consequences, which include financial exclusion and de-risking. Because as again, as was being said, the perception by the private sector and others is that NPOs are a sort of a high risk entity. um, um, so yeah, so I think, and again, in terms of regulation, I think uh, uh, there are models, and I know that what South Africa, I've been reading with great interest in terms of this NPO directorate with seemingly with enforcement powers, and all the red flags are sort of going off in my head, because clearly the charity commission model from the UK is being sought to be transplanted to South Africa, and is it the right model for the context? I'm not so sure. A body with enforcement powers. You don't see that in many parts of the world, and it's easy for a government to say, okay, we have this body and we're giving it all the enforcement powers, and then to take a step back. But is it really the right thing for the context, and especially in a context like South Africa's? Yeah, that is the question, I think, that in country need to answer. But yeah, just in terms of, I think because this is about self-regulation, I just wanted to sort of highlight what the FATF says and what some good practice around the world is. So in terms of, what the risk assessment says, and they sort of, in terms of what the methodology, the FATF methodology on recommendation 8 says, of course, it says you need to have in place risk-based measures. That's in line with the risk-based approach, and that's part of recommendation 8.1. And in a footnote, it says countries may consider where they exist self-regulatory measures and related internal control measures in place within NPOs, in determining risk. So when you do the risk assessment of the sector, as South Africa did a few years ago, and you determine inherent risk, how do you then go from that inherent risk to determining if there is any residual risk? So you look at laws, rules, regulations in place, but what you also need to do is look at what the sector itself has put in place in terms of self-regulatory measures. So self-regulatory measures are not some external measures that are imposed by the government or that are put in place by government. It's what the sector itself does. So what NPOs do themselves, and I'll explain this in a bit more, what the sector does as a whole, that sort of results in mitigating that inherent risk. And then you need to come to a calculation of residual risk, if there is any, and then try and mitigate that. And again, it reiterates this in 8.4 of the methodology, saying that risk-based measures, when you're monitoring compliance. So the first bit is about determining risk, and the second bit is about monitoring the compliance of NPOs with this focused, proportionate risk-based measures. And then this also needs to take into account, self-regulatory measures and related internal control measures. So clearly the FATF is saying that if self-regulatory measures are in place, and if these are adjudged as being robust enough, the government really needs to do less. And that, at the end of the day, is the crux of the risk-based approach, that then the government is left to focus potentially on those minuscule amount of NPOs that are at high risk. And you heard Glenn say what the typologies of those high risk NPOs are, as was determined in the last risk assessment, and that of course could change with time. So the government, and it's not that when you identify those typologies, that all NPOs that fall within those typologies, are at risk of being abused. They just have a potential of being more vulnerable to that abuse. And then the government can work with those NPOs to actually mitigate that risk. I mean, that's the whole purpose of this. So that's your what the standards say. Um, and I always give the example of countering terrorism, and we've had long years of experience for that. So you have your kinetic countering of terrorism, which is what law enforcement does. But as research has shown over the years, best way to counter terrorism is actually to address root causes, for example. So why do people, what are the push factors why people get pushed into radicalization, or what are the pull factors? So you address the root causes of the push and pull factors in terms of the economy and jobs and this and that and everything around it, right? In terms of terrorism. So similarly, for terrorism financing, you have, of course, countering the terrorism financing specific stuff, and you do that through your gatekeepers, which are the banks and your designated non-financial businesses and professions, etc., who are the frontline gatekeepers, sort of, ensuring that, terrorism financing doesn't happen. It includes law enforcement, this and that. And then you have terrorism financing relevant. And that's basically where self-regulation comes in. So if nonprofit organizations themselves are well governed, are accountable, are transparent, then they will not be abused for either, there won't be corruption, there won't be fraud, there won't be terrorism financing. So that's a terrorism financing relevant measure. So self-regulation falls within that bucket. It may not be terrorism financing specific, but it leads to overall self-hygiene of the sector. So it's terrorism financing relevant. And that's what also the FATF best practice paper, which was published in late 2023, says. So the best approach for NPOs to ensure that they're not abused is to put in place good governance, strong financial management measures, which include robust internal and financial controls and risk management procedures and measures. And of course, I understand that, a lot of the sector in South Africa may be voluntary, may be small organizations. So then you have to sort of tier it accordingly. And it's also then the risk-based approach, right? Are those organizations really at risk of terrorism financing? What they need to do needs to be proportional to what they are and what the risk is, basically. And of course, it also says that, rules and standards applied by self-regulatory organizations and accrediting institutions are to be considered as mitigating factors. And, the best practice paper goes on to say, sort of outline what these self-regulatory measures are, which include governance, financial transparency and accountability, program planning and monitoring, partner-donor relationships. These are just some of the things. So what does governance entail? For example, the fact that you're set up and run according to local laws. In most contexts, NPOs need to register, but not in all contexts, and there are examples where countries have said, yes, we don't require our nonprofits organizations to register, all of them, that this is the history of, nonprofits in our country. And they have convinced the assessment team coming into the country that is their context and that is their history, and they understand the risk, and that risk doesn't inhere with the non-registered organizations, and they have got largely compliant ratings on recommendation 8. So it's also how, as a country, you're able to present your story, to understand your risk and to demonstrate that you have an understanding of where that risk lies, so that the assessment and the regulation and the oversight can be proportional. And of course, other stuff around governing boards. In terms of financial transparency, it's the usual stuff you need to know, of course, where your funds are coming from, have two persons oversee your financial transactions, you keep adequate records of your transactions, know to what end your funds have been used. Larger NPOs, very professional large NPOs can get their finances audited. If you are, and many of you on this call are large NGOs, I think, or some of you are, that donors demand audited finances for projects. So you do that anyway. Use, where possible, the formal financial sector. But of course, we know that there's de-risking, and we know the other problems associated, and that is a consequence, unintended consequence of this whole financial integrity framework. So, sometimes that is not possible, but again, as far as possible, because if you use the formal financial sector, they are gatekeepers, so they will do some of these checks anyway. And of course, program planning and monitoring, you don't need individual beneficiary vetting, but you should know where your, funds are going, and, that you have risk mitigation measures in place. Humanitarian work, of course, is guided by the principles of international humanitarian law. So that sort of trumps counterterrorism law and regulation. And the UN Security Council has, also passed a humanitarian exemption in its asset freeze framework. So that has to be taken into account also by the banks. So humanitarian law is sort of at the top of the pyramid, so to speak. But if there are questions, I can answer that. So what are some of these types of self-regulatory measures? And as Ricardo was saying as well, you have a history of this. You've probably had some versions of these through the years. They could be voluntary sector standards, they could be sector codes with sort of independent verification of compliance or a certification of accreditation. You could, of course, have donor-enforced self-regulation. Sometimes you have market-based instruments. Sometimes you have co-regulation or government-allied self-regulation, but we don't see, it's not that common. There is an ISO 9001 certification for NPOs who are looking to improve their structure and their internal processes. Of course, this is not for everybody. I'll just give you an example of, because I'm based in the Netherlands, of the Dutch fundraising regulator, CBF. You can also go to their website. They have it in English as well. And their aim is to promote trustworthy fundraising and expenditure. So it's only for those NPOs who raise funds from the public. And they award a quality standard. The quality standard, it's sort of a tiered sort of seal, and it's based on the size and the complexity of the organization, and they check things like whether you're aligned with your mission, what your sources of funding are, what your fundraising methods are, what your financial management policy is, your programmatic objectives, what your governance structure is, how you report annually, whether you provide some information publicly. And large organizations obviously need to do more, smaller organizations less so. The criteria are put in place, by a group of eminent experts from multiple discipline who are sort of, known for being dedicated to certain principles. It's funded by the fees it gets from NPOs for going through the accreditation process. And this, once you have that CBF recognition or the CBF seal, it's acknowledged by banks and also through this banking association standard that we have, sector standard, as a risk lowering factor for NPOs. So that enables sort of banks to do simplified due diligence on NPOs. Again, similarly, and I won't go into this in much detail, but there is this network of humanitarian organizations which has developed a due diligence tool, and it encompasses the following dimensions, basically, so whether and these are for sort of larger humanitarian organizations, so whether they have risk management or, data protection, safeguarding, the things that are important for humanitarian organizations, apart from, the governance and the financial controls and the legal stuff. And that also makes due diligence in that sense passportable, so that you can you don't need duplication of effort, and organizations can be reviewed against common agreed standards. And it helps organizations, it supports organizations move up that due diligence tier chain. So you start with at a lower tier, and then you can go up 3 tiers depending on your compliance levels. And self-regulation it's starting to be recognized in FATF mutual evaluations. So the Netherlands had its last mutual evaluation report published in August 2022. And this is what it said in the report, that self-regulation is a key feature of the Dutch non-profit sector. The Netherlands has no supervisory authority to monitor NPOs. So we do not have my NPO needs to do is to have a website, to publish our annual narrative report, and to publish our annual financial report. That's it. And of course, we have had to, when we were set up, we needed to register, in that, at the Chamber of Commerce. We have, that number. We have, we are on the beneficial ownership register, the people who control the organization. But there is no supervisory authority to monitor NPOs. It relies on voluntary certification mechanisms such as, X status and Y seal to promote transparency and accountability. Authorities have undertaken outreach to the categories of good faith NPOs vulnerable to potential TF abuse, so risk-based approach, and then you undertake outreach to them to, make them aware of their risks. They are aware of the risk of TF abuse and are implementing mitigating measures. The assessment teams has some concerns as to whether the existing voluntary regulatory framework could be sufficient to detect bad faith NPOs willingly sponsoring terrorism. But, bad faith NPOs which are set up for that purpose, that is not a failure of the NPO themselves. It's a failure of, the sector in that sense, in the sense that they were able to register, and then if there is criminal activity, it goes through the criminal judicial and criminal process basically. So yeah, I'm going to stop there and happy to take questions, but just to say that each country comes with its own context, comes with its own history of NPO regulation and oversight. Some of the conversation around FATF and terrorism financing and Recommendation 8 has really muddied the waters and has led to a more securitized approach towards regulation and oversight and monitoring, which, for the vast majority of the sector is really not necessary. I mean, the vast majority of the sector is at low risk for terrorism financing. For that proportion of the sector, all you need is outreach and awareness raising. And for the small minority that is potentially vulnerable to terrorism financing abuse, you need to, do a more enhanced outreach and potentially some monitoring, or potentially help them put in place certain measures. But self-regulation is really the way to go. Good governance, good, making the sector robust so that it's not abused for anything, whether that's corruption, fraud, terrorism financing, money laundering, whatever the case may be. It is, agnostic in that sense in terms of the risks. And I think, just very worried about this whole body that's being talked about with statutory powers, and not sure that that is the right thing for South Africa. But I don't know whether that ship has sailed. You'll be better placed to let me know about that. But I'll stop there and happy to take questions.
Any questions or comments for Sangeeta? We have her with us now. Sangeeta, that was a really eye-opening presentation. Thank you. And it's amazing how well, as you describe it, it works. And this is primarily in the Netherlands, right?
Yeah, and in many other countries too. I mean, we work across the world, and Yeah, I mean, you don't see the charity commission model very often, the UK model with, a body with statutory powers. That's very rare because when there is a problem, that often goes through the normal judicial and criminal justice systems.
Yeah.
So, whether you actually need a body with statutory powers is a moot point, really. But yeah, there are different, and we're trying to do an oversight, a study on oversight mechanisms of the NPO sector for TF in different parts of the world. And it's a thorny issue, it's a difficult issue. In many parts of the world, the Financial Intelligence Unit sort of became the default sort of regulator of NPOs, because NPOs were made designated non-financial businesses and professions with sort of reporting entities in some parts of the world. And the FATF now clearly says that they shouldn't be reporting entities. The countries have had to change laws, etc. And then the question still remains, who does the oversight of the at-risk NPOs, etc. But I think Anne has a question.
Yeah, go ahead, Anne.
Yes, thank you for that. How interesting that you don't have an oversight body of NPOs, but you do register, I think you said, with the Chamber of Commerce, correct?
That's right, yes.
And then what sort of volume are we looking at? I mean, how many organizations are registered with that Chamber of Commerce?
I have the figures somewhere because we did all this before the last evaluation, and let me try and dig that out. But it's hundreds of thousands really in the Netherlands.
Is it
and then
also
there
a
are
large number?
very, very large number. And then of course you have the religious organizations, and it's like a Venn diagram. So you have associations, foundations, religious organizations, and different bits apply to different bits of the regulation apply to different parts of the sector. But no, there is no regulator or regulating entity. But it is a high trust society. So again, I'll make a difference, right? There are high trust societies, low trust societies. What works in high trust societies may not work in low trust societies. So it's very context dependent. But yeah, you have to figure out what works for each context in that sense.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sangeeta. There's a comment in the chat that says, quite frankly, good governance is function of values. How do we get people to develop good values and translate these to governance? So I think Sangeeta kind of started making a point about, the context is everything, and you have high trust societies, low trust societies, and I think probably talks to that comment that you have there. Good governance should be a value system. However, it is also a fiduciary responsibility. Thanks, Glenn. Okay, it looks then, Sangeeta, thank you very much for those insights. They were great. I mean, I heard you talk about unregistered NPOs as well. Again, it's something that we're kind of struggling with here and at the moment, but we don't know how things will end up in the next little while. So I am now going to hand over to Anne. Anne will try and synthesize the discussions, and she will lead us through the way forward. Anne will, of course, I hope, help to bridge the gap between today's ideas and the concrete actions that we need. And all of this is, of course, towards establishing, making sure we have enough information that feeds into the policy brief. Thanks, Anne. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you to all the co-facilitators. I was going to say co-conspirators. But thank you.
More or less.
Yeah, more or less conspirators. Yes, there's a lot going on, Sangeeta, as you are aware, here at the moment with the amendment bill. And one of the things that came up in an informal meeting yesterday with Treasury, some people from Treasury, was they don't know who to talk to in the NPO sector to actually bounce their thinking when they're changing legislation. So moving forward and finding a way forward, it means with self-regulation we need to start forming units and groups that can interface on major issues like amendments to the bill. So how can we improve public trust and effective regulation, have sound governance, meaningful accountability, and ultimately an enabling environment? This enabling environment is the underbelly of the NPO Act. It has been from the very beginning, hence why it's a voluntary registration. But the way things are going with banking and so on and so forth, that could be changing to a more formal environment. And without us talking to each other and forming groups and focusing on the issues at hand, hence the self-regulation grouping is vital going forward. The big thing we need to look at, what would be the right model for South Africa? Those of you who recall, the NPO Act was in place to get rid of that rather awful fundraising act, where you would be chosen on which side of politics your organization stood. Now it's not based on that, and hence why we've got the NPO Act. But those of us that were in the room back in the early 90s, maybe we missed a trick or two on this because we were so keen to get this NPO Act out. And there are a couple of things that have cropped up quite recently that have made us think we need to go back to the drawing board. And this is where self-regulation groups can plow in their thinking and their thoughts. So our big challenge would be understanding the role of the representative bodies. Earlier we heard about the umbrella organisations, like the Alliance of Non-Profit Organisations, and hashtag Unmute for civil society, and so on and so forth. What about the donors and grant makers? How do we integrate with them? How do they talk to us? There's no South African Grant Makers Association anymore. Those of us used to interact with them and go to their annual conferences and what have you. We don't have that anymore, and we do need to be able to talk to each other on a similar level. And then, of course, the last thing would be the government. Also, other things that we feel should be in the regulations. Requirements, but also to align with what works for us in South Africa. So, yeah. So the voluntary adoption, working in a voluntary space on this, to develop codes, to revise existing codes, to develop ethics, and a set of principles, and as somebody said earlier, a value system. Each organization should have a value system, and the sector should have a value system as well. So I'll leave it there, and over to you, Ferrell.
Thank you so much, Anne, for that. And I think there's a lot there that you said, for us to also be thinking about, given that the stuff is coming at us at such a pace, and we're often not ready to respond as quickly as is required, as you mentioned in that session yesterday. The individual we spoke to said, we don't know who to liaise with in the nonprofit sector, which I find quite interesting sometimes, I mean, we're all here, there are many groups then that they must be familiar with who we are. We just have to wait for a media article to kind of say, hey, here we are, can we engage? I must say that they're quite open to engage once you reach out to them, that too. But imagine we miss an announcement or something. We're in trouble then, aren't we? Okay, so if there's no other comments and questions, then I'd like to just close the session by thanking our presenters who provided the roadmap for the policy brief. They presented some very, very fruitful, important, valuable information, and I hope that all of us who listened are a little bit stronger leaving the session and a little bit more knowledgeable about what are the things that we need to do within our organizations, but also how do we reach out to others to make sure that they know what's going on and can join future webinars like this. So the message is clear. Message came through very clearly. The current path of punitive enforcement is not sustainable. I mean, we make reference to the G Lab that was launched in the General Laws Amendment Bill that came out in January. We need a system, and this message came through over and over by all the presenters. We need a system that is proportionate and risk-based. Underscore that 50, 100 times. We really, really do. And so we need them to hear us. We need our voices to get in there. We will take the insights from today's session, and we will, of course, advocate for a single statutory regulatory body that protects the NPO autonomy while we maintain our high standards, right? The idea is that we want to make sure that no NPO is left behind. So together, and I hope that we have many more others who join in the future, as I said earlier on. So our priority is to ensure that the changes work for everyone, okay? From large international NGOs to small community-based organizations, whoever operates here in the context where we're operating. So I think every NPO deserves a seat at the table. And every NPO deserves to be part of a system that supports rather than hinders our work. I think we can all agree to that. So again, I mean, thank you, Sangeeta, also for bringing the global perspectives. We wanna prove that self-regulation is the best path forward. But also by taking the lead in our own transparency and governance and making sure that we're aligning with what everybody else is doing. In the rest of the world, we can join forces with the likes of your organization. I know that often there's invitations to attend the Global NGO Coalition. There's the Civic Advisory Hub that operates on the African continent. There are many bodies who are doing phenomenal work. As the NPO Working Group, of course, you'll know we try and keep you posted on everything that's happening that impacts and affects us. But in the event that you just, I want to find out what's going on, you can go to the website. There is an NPO Working Group website on the NPO website, and just key in, and I'm pretty sure you'll find it. So please continue to engage with us. Look out for the next webinar, which is scheduled for the 11th of March. And I want to thank you for your time. I really, really appreciate it. Thank you very much. Thank you to the NPO team for holding the webinar together. Thank you to the presenters and members of the NPO Working Group. We often don't all have the time, but they're committed. I know that they are. Thank you, everyone. Okay, have a great rest of the week.
Thank you, Feria.
Pleasure. Thank
Bye.
you. Cheers.